Okay, so you should have already watched all the lectures about the Romanesque, and now we're going to talk about the Gothic period. This is the last era that we talk about in Art History 1. So I've broken it up into several shorter lectures. This is the intro, and then we'll have one about French architecture and the Gothic in general, and one about stained glass in particular, one about manuscripts, one about sculpture, one that focuses in on English Gothic architecture, one on German Gothic architecture, all that kind of fun stuff. All right, so let's start by talking about what do I mean by Gothic. I don't mean my stylistic choices of always wearing black, though that is related to this period, I suppose. All right, so what we call the Gothic style starts in the French region of Europe surrounding Paris called Île-de-France, which means the island of France, okay? It is called Opus Franciscanum, which means French work, okay? It's also called at the time Opus Modernum, which means modern work. So it was the first artistic movement to be labeled as modernism, which is kind of a funny thing to think about because we sort of think of it as the opposite of what we call modernism, thinking about art history today. All right, so here are some of the characteristics of what makes something Gothic. Pointed arches, right? Not round arches like in the Romanesque, but pointed arches, pointed arch lancets, flying buttresses, stained glass, particularly rose windows with stained glass, having a triforium in our elevation in cathedrals, and lots of ribbed groin vaults. Okay, so we're going to look at all of these elements independently. Like the Romanesque, the contemporary people of the Gothic era did not use the term Gothic. That's something that's added later. Specifically, it's coined by Giorgio Vasari in the 1500s when he wrote Introduction to the Three Arts of Design. That was written in, I think it was published in 1550. So Vasari attributed late medieval art and architecture to the Goths as a group of people. So we've talked about them before, the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths and all those guys. His assessment of Gothic art was very negative. So he describes it as barbarous and monstrous. He's not alone. About a century earlier than that, Lorenzo Ghiberti said the same thing in his written work called Commentaries, which described the Middle Ages in general as the Dark Ages and as a period of cultural decline. Medieval refers to eras between good art of classicism and the Renaissance. So medieval and Gothic are used interchangeably for a while by early people writing about this time period. The modern view is kind of the opposite. So in contemporary times, we have a little different view from a scholarly perspective about what Gothic is. We tend to think the Gothic period was one of the high points of achievement in Western architecture. Contributing factors to this thought vary, and we'll go into different specific stylistic things that were also just kind of structural achievements and stylistic achievements that had not been seen before, lots of innovations in building techniques and kinds of art. Some of the things that contribute to the development of what we now call the Gothic era, we have widespread prosperity in Western Europe in the 12th and 13th centuries, which is pretty much what we consider to be the Gothic era, the 12th and 13th centuries, so right after the Romanesque. Cities become even more important, and remember in the intro to the Romanesque, I talked about the development of independent cities and how that contributed a lot to this rise in architectural innovation. In fact, cities kind of become the center of intellectual and religious life. So we have a little shift in cultural and intellectual prominence in different areas, particularly in cities. We have the development of guilds. Guilds are groups of people, of artisans and artists and sculptors and crafts people who get together and they're like, where are all the people who dye cloth, and where are all the stonemasons, and where are all the glaziers who do stained glass? And so by getting together and exchanging ideas and techniques and skills, we see kind of a strengthening in the technical development of these different kinds of trades. We also have the development of the first modern universities come about in the Gothic period. Vernacular literature, which means works written in local spoken languages instead of just Latin or Greek, become popular, which means more people learn to read and have access to information. The papacy is at the height of its power, so the church as patron is very powerful in this period and has lots of money to fund things like art and architecture. The Crusades are still a thing, so we talked about the Crusades when we were talking about the Romanesque. Independent nations begin to take shape, so we start seeing the development of what become the nations in Western Europe that we know today. And so a lot of different factors contributing to this period that we now call the Gothic. For Gothic art and architecture, we really have three major regions that we're going to talk about in terms of Western Europe, and that's France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire. Okay? And as I said, this is the intro, so I'm just going to kind of break things down for you. So this is what the map of Western Europe looks like at this time. So we've talked about the Umayyad Caliphate before, so you're familiar with what's going on there. We know that in the east we've got the Byzantine and then the Ottoman Turks coming in. We've talked a little about the Holy Roman Empire. It's Charlemagne, the Carolingians, and all those guys. So we'll get into this a little more and look at what this looks like. Okay, so the Gothic's broken down like this. We have the early Gothic, which is 1140 to 1194. We're going to talk about a guy named Abbot Suger, who begins rebuilding the French Royal Abbey at Saint-Denis. We're going to talk about Saint-Denis and Chartres Cathedral and their not just their stained glass development and their structural development, but also the statues that are created there. We'll also look at Leon Cathedral and the important structural development there of a triforium. The High Gothic is from 1194 to 1300. This is when we see Chartres rebuilt and kind of set as the standard for High Gothic churches, 4-part nave vaults braced by external flying buttresses, 3-story elevation, stained glass windows, and we'll look at the influence that stretches into Germany and England as well. And then we'll also look at manuscript illumination, which is still a kind of an important thing in this time period. The late Gothic is from 1300 to 1500. The flamboyant style in France and the perpendicular style in England emphasize the surface embellishments over structural clarity. So we see some pretty big shifts in what's happening with the stonework. The characteristic features are delicate webs of flame-like tracery and fan vaults with pendants resembling stalactites, which takes a little note from the Makarnas that we looked at when we were looking at Islamic art and architecture. And also we see the humanization of holy figures in statuary, particularly in Germany. Okay, so in the first video after the intro, we are going to be going to France and talking about architecture.